here came Alexander the Great all these years later, and every one of those prophecies came true. Let's look at them again just for fun. So we have the destruction of Tyre, many nations, like the sea. The walls will be pulled down, and then that city will be scraped and made of bare rock. Well, Alexander did that. And out of the sea become a place to spread fish nets. And for centuries, that's exactly what happened out on the ruined city of Tyre out of the ocean. The fishermen would go out there, I've seen the pictures, spread their nets out to dry. And every detail. And I remember reading this years and years ago before I knew the backstory. And I'd come to the 29th chapter and think, well, why didn't Nebuchadnezzar get anything for this? He had this campaign, and God said he's coming. He came. And then I read the rest of the story where the city had been moved out here. So by the time Nebuchadnezzar got into the city, there wasn't anything left of it. Now, that's Alexander the Great. Now, when he got done with Tyre, he heads for Jerusalem. And this is where the story really gets interesting. So, Alexander is finished with Tyre. He hears about the riches in the land of God's people, and he heads for Jerusalem. So, after Tyre, he enters the land of Israel. Now, on the way to Jerusalem, Alexander is met by a guy named Jaddua. Oh, not sure what that means. But this fellow's a high priest. And I want to describe the scene for you so that we get this. So Jaddua or Jaddua is at the head of a long procession of people dressed in white. The high priest is dressed in purple and scarlet, and he has a mitre on his head. He said, God warned me in a dream to meet Alexander the Great outside of Jerusalem, dressed like this and with this procession of people. So Alexander approaches the priest alone, and he salutes him and says, I had a dream about you. I dreamed about you in Macedonia. And Alexander was under the impression that his army was under divine conduct. And Alexander told his soldiers, do not hurt the Jews. And he accompanied them back to Jerusalem, and he goes up into the temple. And guess what book in the Bible he was shown? The book of Daniel. And the priest said to Alexander, we've been expecting you. Now I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he says, look at this. This is you. And Alexander read the prophecies about himself in the book of Daniel and said, yep, that's me. And so Alexander allowed the Jews to continue in their laws and religion, and every 7th year they were given relief from paying to the Greeks the tribute that others had to pay. And when the Samaritans saw this, remember what I said a few hours ago? They said, we're Jews too. So they want to get on the bandwagon. But this is an incredible story, and wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall and seen this procession going out to meet this Greek conqueror, who then is shown the scriptures and says, yep, that's me. Well, from Jerusalem, Alexander goes to Egypt, where he founded the city of Alexandria, and his goal was to export Greek culture into every country that he had conquered. And then from Egypt, he marched toward the Persian capital. Now, we're going to have to skip over a lot of this. You can read this, but he massacred a lot of Persians. He burned the palaces of their kings. He marched to the Indus River, where he was almost ready to go into Egypt, and his men said this. Alexander's men said, we've been doing this for 16, 17 years, or 13 years. We want to go home. We are done. And at age 32, Alexander died of a fever.
Didn't you mean India, not Egypt?
What did I say?
Egypt.
Thank you, India. Thank you. He had plans to march into India, and the men said, oh, we've had enough, we're turning back. Now, I want you to turn to that sheet where all those scribbles are. Because I want you to see some of the details from this guy's life. What an amazing life. You can see the time frame there. And now let's talk about, how do we know all these stories about Alexander the Great? How do we know that any of them are true? And I don't want you to miss the point here. We'll make the point very, very concisely, very firmly in about 15 minutes. Has anybody seen a movie about Alexander's life? Has anybody read a book about Alexander's life? And here are all these stories about cutting the Gordian knot. Here are stories about Alexander's compassion and Alexander's cruelty and the battles, and it's all laid out there in history. Or is it? Well, what are the sources? Well, here are the sources. Now, I want you to draw a line on your paper above the word Aryan. See the word Aryan? You see where I've started, a little line, and just draw a line all the way across it. Here's how we know anything at all about Alexander the Great. Number one, the Royal Journal. Now, a Royal Journal is kind of like a diary. And so, in the Royal Journal, all this information, we marched here, we did this, we saw this. Well, the Royal Journal. Next, you see the word Callisthenes. Alexander the Great killed Callisthenes. Callisthenes was one of Aristotle's nephews, but Alexander, in a rage, thought that Callisthenes was somehow plotting against him, and he killed him. Callisthenes kept a record of these journeys as he would march. Well, he's Aristotle's nephew, and as the army would do all these things and go here and conquer these people and sell so many into slavery and all these things that Alexander did, why Callisthenes wrote it all down. Now, wouldn't it be great if we had a copy of the Royal Journal, but nobody's ever seen a copy? The only way we know it existed is that it exists. It's mentioned in letters and documents from way after Alexander the Great's life, but nobody's ever seen a copy of the Royal Journal. It would be great if we had the writings of Callisthenes, but again, the only reason we know that existed because it's mentioned in other documents. Nobody alive has ever seen the Royal Journal or the writings of Callisthenes. All right, let's drop down to the word Ptolemy. Ptolemy had Alexander the Great had 4 generals. One of the generals was named Ptolemy, and Ptolemy, it is said, kept a record of these 13, 14 years of marching and warfare. But nobody's ever seen it. It's disappeared into history. I mentioned the name Aristobulus this morning. There are a lot of people by the name of Aristobulus in history. This is Aristobulus the historian. It's not the one we'll mention later on when we talk about the Seleucids. Aristobulus is a historian, and Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, and Aristobulus the historian accompanied Alexander the Great, and he wrote a history of all the things that happened in these journeys. But nobody's ever seen a copy of it. It's disappeared into history as well. Now, if you stop somebody on the street and say, do you believe in Alexander the Great? Why, of course. Everybody's heard that name, why he did this and this, and he, well, really? There are 2 other sources for information on Alexander the Great that are close to his own life. And one is a body of literature called the Romances. Every great woman in history, every great man in history, when they die, and I made a joke about this a few hours ago, they have things written about them that are romanticized. You know, George Washington, again, cutting down the cherry tree. Abraham Lincoln walking, 2 or 3 miles to return a penny or 2, and he was a storekeeper. Now, some of those things are based on truth, but they may not be precisely true. But when it comes to Alexander the Great's life, we have the so-called romances. And this talks about Alexander the Great in glowing terms. In fact, in the romances, according to a letter which mentions the romances, Alexander the Great, his mother claimed, was virgin born. He was a demigod. Interesting. But nobody's ever seen a copy of the romances. They've disappeared into history too. Now we come to the peripatetics. When you look up the word peripatetic, it means a wanderer. And this designation is given to wandering philosophers. People who just, well, they wander around and teach. And the peripatetics hated Alexander. They saw him as cruel and vindictive, and you know, some people just don't like soldiers, conquerors. They just don't. So, with all the good things said about Alexander in the romances, the mirror image is that in the peripatetics, all these bad things are said about Alexander. Well, even in the worst of things, you can find some truth, but they've all disappeared too. Those writings are gone. They survive only in letters and documents from antiquity, but the whole document itself is gone. Now, you drew a line on your paper. Everything above that line, you see my little notes there, everything above that line is gone. And everything below that line comes about 200 to 500 years after Alexander died. Now let that soak in. Do you recall when you were a child and you played telephone?